Let's bring in former FBI General Counsel and senior member of the Mueller probe, Andrew Weissmann. Andrew, it's always great to talk with you. This is on an historic evening, but I do want to go back just for a moment to the dichotomy between these federal and state charges. Because I think we talk a lot about the campaign finance aspects of this payoff to Ms. Daniels, to Stormy Daniels. But this is a state prosecutor. So a federal election isn't in his purview. So what we're talking about is the same facts. It's the same facts that put Michael Cohen in prison with a federal indictment, but these are state charges. So can you just talk about that dichotomy? Because we don't know what these charges, they're still sealed, but it's looking more like something like falsifying business records, lying about the purpose of the funds, not a campaign finance case. Is that accurate?
It more or less is. The way I used to look at this when I was a prosecutor is it's, I think, a very human way of thinking about things, which is there's a set of facts. Somebody you can prove has done A, B, C, and D. And then as a lawyer, you take your sort of legal grid and you say, okay, what kind of laws did that violate? And so there are federal laws and there are state laws. And so the same set of facts can result in crimes such as wire fraud or mail fraud or securities fraud. And they can also result in certain state crimes. It's one ball of wax in terms of what you're dealing with, but there are different tripwires you could have gone over in the course of that conduct. So what you're seeing here is, I think, the same ball of wax where it resulted in federal crimes that Michael Cohen pled guilty to and a federal judge agreed was a crime and sentenced him on. But at the same time, you can look at this because the feds didn't go forward for a whole variety of reasons as state crimes. And that is what Alvin Bragg has now, it's been confirmed, done in bringing these charges and seeing what are the state crimes that are alleged. It's important to note that he may have found that a sort of enhancement for these state crimes comes from either state campaign laws or federal campaign laws. There is a way that they may form a part of the charges here, and it would be permissible potentially to do that, but we don't know yet. I mean, that's something that a lot of legal nerds like me are waiting to see exactly how the charges play out.
There's so many people that were involved, like sort of different pieces of this scheme. Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to tax evasion, false statements to a federally insured bank, causing an unlawful corporate contribution, excessive campaign contribution, and false statements to the U.S. Congress, all things that were associated with assisting Donald Trump in covering up this affair. Allen Weisselberg, who has now dropped his Donald Trump-related lawyers, which is interesting. He pleaded guilty to grand larceny in the second degree, criminal tax fraud in the third degree, a scheme to defraud, conspiracy, criminal tax fraud, offering a false instrument and filing of the first degree, and falsifying business records. Do you think there's a significance here to him changing lawyers away from the lawyers who were associated with Donald Trump, really in the last couple of days?
I do, but I think, with all due respect, as they say, I sort of view it potentially the opposite way in that I know the lawyers who used to represent Allen Weisselberg, the former CFO, who you correctly say has pleaded guilty to a host of crimes, and those were real ethical lawyers. And I think that their sin was that they were independent. There are reports that the DA was increasingly putting pressure on Mr. Weisselberg. There are facts alleged in Letitia James' Attorney General complaint that suggests that Mr. Weisselberg has liability, criminal liability for additional crimes. And I think the sin of his lawyers who took him through his guilty plea is that they are real lawyers who represented him and not the organization. And so I'm not saying casting aspersions on the new counsel, but I view it as a sign that he that Mr. Weisselberg may not be cooperating, but he may in fact face additional charges. That is just a guess. I'm sort of intuiting that from my own knowledge of these people and sort of what I would do if I were in that situation as a prosecutor, and how I would try and sort of bring additional charges with respect to Mr. Weisselberg to seek his cooperation, and if he didn't cooperate, to hold him account for additional crimes.
Interesting. Let me a couple of other people. David Pecker, and of course, this was the man from the National Enquirer. He met twice with the grand jury. And it was important in terms of trying to discredit the notion that the payments were just to protect from embarrassment to Melania Trump. And this was in 2021, American Media Inc., which owns the Enquirer, settled a complaint with the Federal Election Commission alleging that they unlawfully aided Trump in 2016. The FEC found that Pecker and AMI had violated federal election laws by making a payment to Playboy model Karen McDougal in order to purchase and bury a story about her 2006 affair with Trump, same year as Ms. Daniels. And Pecker entered a non-prosecution agreement in which he admitted that the payments had been made in order to help Trump's campaign. So he's the other character. And of course, there is Stormy Daniels. And let me read the response from Ms. Daniels' attorney, Clark Brewster. And this was their statement. The indictment of Donald Trump is no cause for joy. The hard work and conscientiousness of the grand jurors must be respected. Now let truth and justice prevail. No one is above the law. And now let me read the statement from Ron DeSantis, which just went away. Hopefully we'll get that back. Ron DeSantis has issued a statement saying that he will not help to stand in the way, will not aid. Okay, here it is. Okay, moments ago, Governor Ron DeSantis tweeted an attack on DA Alvin Bragg, accusing him of weaponizing the legal system. He also said, Florida, quote, Florida will not assist in an extradition request, given the questionable circumstances at issue with this Soros-backed Manhattan prosecutor and his political agenda. That's a strange statement. Do you want to comment on that? That is an odd statement from a governor, no? That's an odd statement.
Well, I think I'd make two comments about it. One, it's hard to even call it a dog whistle of anti-Semitism in that statement.
Yeah.
And a governor should be respecting the rule of law. One of the things, and I don't mean to be preachy, but I think on a night like tonight, which is so historic, it does warrant stepping back and noting that many people in this country during the Trump administration saw the rule of law by Donald Trump, by the Attorney General Barr, and by a host of people in Congress and others be trampled on. The corrupt use of pardons, the firing of Jim Comey, the obstruction of cases in the Department of Justice for friends of the president, the documented obstruction of justice by the then president that was documented by Robert Mueller in the team that I was a part of. And all of that was so anathema to what many people viewed America stood for, which is the rule of law, and something that we thought we were proud of and was a beacon for the rest of the world. And so for today, seeing Alvin Bragg, and I think it's notable, an African-American DA have the tenacity, putting up with these kinds of attacks and just keeping his head down is, I think, a sign that this country is on track, that people actually respect the rule of law and are willing to do their duty, even in the face of smear campaigns and worse, including death threats. And it's worth noting that we owe a debt to people in those public positions who really are sacrificing quite a lot that they didn't sign up for to uphold the rule of law in this country. It's a shame that we've gotten to this place when other countries are ones that we ask to emulate. And fortunately, we're in a position where now emulating other countries that have held senior political leaders to account. But I do think this is a important step in the right direction.